So essentially, solar energy is using some of the energy or the irradiation coming from the sun, converting that into electricity or heat, and using that to power any domestic, commercial, or industrial uses on Earth. So in terms of how that conversion happens, there's so many different technologies, but principally they use solar panels, solar modules that have certain metals or chemicals that are able to convert some of that irradiation into electrons, which when they flow through a wire, that's electricity. So in terms of how the technology works is we're just converting irradiation into electricity, mostly, but occasionally into heat as well. In terms of how solar power is stored, so primarily, at least within the electricity sector, which is where solar energy is mostly deployed currently, we use batteries to store some of that solar. So lithium-ion batteries are able to take excess solar energy and store that. However, there's other means of being able to store energy. You can use electricity available to pump up water, for example, and then when there's a need for that energy, pump the water back down in a hydroelectric dam.
So Habiba, you work on finding clean energy solutions in order to mitigate climate change. And as you just briefly explained, solar panels are one of the solutions that help us prevent burning greenhouse gases. But can solar energy power a nation alone, or does it have to be complemented with other power sources like hydropower or coal? How does that work?
So I think there's two answers to that question. The short answer is no. So you can't use solar power to power a nation alone, primarily because it's only available during the daytime. So during nighttime or during periods where you have a lot of cloud cover, you can't really generate a lot of energy or electricity from some of the solar panels. An alternative is to have other forms of electricity generation that you can use at nighttime. So this could be either fossil fuel means of generation, so coal, natural gas, even oil, or you could have cleaner forms of energy, nuclear power, hydroelectric power that are also available at nighttime.
Just to also jump into this conversation, the use of solar power is just so expansive now. You find it basically in homes, in businesses, but is there a place where it's most beneficial? Is it mostly for the industrial purposes or for residential? And is there competition between those entities?
Yeah, so in terms of really where you can use solar power, if you're being supplied by grid infrastructure, for example, then the national grid serves both domestic, commercial, and industrial consumers. So building solar infrastructure to provide electricity into a national grid can really supply anybody that's connected to that grid infrastructure. I think where solar offers a lot of opportunity is for off-grid settings. So particularly in developing countries, such as most of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a lot of rural communities and they're typically very large, very geographically spread rural communities. It can be very expensive to extend transmission lines and the grid infrastructure into every single village. Right. So in those instances, solar lends itself to being a technology that you can decentralize quite easily. Of course, the sun is available everywhere. You can build out smaller units of solar panels, build out a small distribution network, and then supply an isolated community. So I think that's where within Sub-Saharan Africa, where I work, that's where solar has seen the most success as opposed to being connected to the grid. It's because it's able to fulfill that purpose of providing energy where other forms of energy, that fossil fuel generation or the grid it's not economically viable to extend them to.
When you look at a country like Nigeria, where the power grid has failed multiple times in the last few months, and the country is heavily dependent on diesel fuel, petrol for generators, don't you think does that affect the oil and gas industry? And what role can government play in making sure that solar power is complemented by other forms of power in a way that benefits the country?
Yeah, so in terms of competition and disruption, Nigeria is a really interesting context of how a really interesting, I think, case study of how the prospects of solar have improved because of some of the volatility we're seeing in some of the oil and gas markets. So since COVID and the Ukrainian conflict, that there's been a disruption in the oil markets, and we see oil has been priced consistently at over $100 a barrel. And in Nigeria, diesel prices have tripled, for example. So from a consumer standpoint, actually, solar is now by far the cheapest option as a source of electricity for your home or for your business. The issue is that there are other barriers that are preventing that adoption. So we're still seeing significant diesel and petrol generator use in the country.